Every morning, in a busy city subway station, a mysterious German shepherd boards the train. Alone. No leash, no owner. He sits quietly, waiting for his stop, then gets off like he knows exactly where he's going. Daniel Carter, a commuter who takes the same train every day, notices the dog's strange routine. Who owns him? Why does he take the subway every morning? One day Daniel decides to follow him. Then, he places a GPS tracker on the dog's collar. But when he checks the location history, what he discovers is absolutely shocking. Stay with us until the end. This story will leave you speechless. The subway station was packed with people rushing to catch their trains. The usual mix of business professionals, students, and exhausted workers filled the platform, their footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. The sound of train doors opening and closing, voices murmuring, and occasional distant announcements created the typical morning chaos. Daniel Carter waited for his train like he did every morning, a coffee cup in one hand and his phone in the other. His job as a systems analyst didn't require much excitement, and his daily commute was predictable. Until today, just as the train screeched to a stop, something unusual caught his eye. A German shepherd calmly walked onto the platform, moving with purpose. He had no leash, no collar, and no owner in sight. The dog stopped near the edge of the platform and waited. Daniel frowned, watching closely. The shepherd didn't seem lost or scared. Instead, he stood there like he belonged, staring ahead at the arriving train, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. The train doors slid open, and without hesitation, the dog stepped inside. Daniel hesitated for a moment, debating whether to follow. A man behind him nudged him forward, forcing him onto the train just as the doors closed. He glanced around. No one seemed to find it strange that a dog had just boarded the subway alone. The German shepherd found a spot near one of the poles and sat down. He wasn't begging, barking, or causing any disturbance. He just sat there, waiting. Daniel couldn't take his eyes off him. The fur was slightly dirty, but not filthy. He looked well-fed, though not perfectly groomed. His ears perked up occasionally as the train moved, as if he was following a mental map, anticipating his stop. For the next 20 minutes, Daniel watched as the dog remained calm, never shifting uncomfortably, never interacting with anyone. Then, as the train slowed at the next stop, the shepherd stood up immediately. His posture changed, alert, focused. Daniel's heart pounded as he saw the dog walk toward the doors, stepping out onto the platform with confidence. Curiosity burned inside him. Where was this dog going? Was someone waiting for him? Without thinking, Daniel followed. The station was quieter than the one they had left, a less crowded part of town. The German shepherd navigated the space like he had done it 1,000 times before, weaving through people, avoiding obstacles with ease. Daniel kept his distance, watching as the dog turned down a side street. The early morning sun reflected off shop windows, and the distant hum of traffic filled the air. The dog didn't wander or hesitate. He walked straight toward a small flower shop. Daniel stopped a few feet away, trying not to seem suspicious. The shepherd lifted his nose, sniffing the air. His eyes softened, and then he sat down. He didn't move. Minutes passed. The dog just waited. Daniel's frown deepened. Was he waiting for someone? Just as the thought crossed his mind, the shop door opened. An elderly woman stepped out, carrying a small watering can. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and she looked down the street before her gaze settled on the German shepherd. She froze. The watering can slipped from her hand, crashing onto the pavement. Her eyes widened with shock, her hands trembling. Her lips parted as she whispered a single word. "Ranger?" Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The German shepherd stood up immediately, tail wagging, but he didn't run to her. He hesitated, looking at her with wide, searching eyes. Something about the moment sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Who was she? Why did this dog travel alone every morning just to wait here? What was he waiting for? Daniel's pulse quickened as he watched the old woman, her body frozen in place, staring at the dog as if she had seen a ghost. The German shepherd, Ranger, stood still too, his tail wagging slightly, but his eyes locked onto her face with an intensity that made Daniel's chest tighten. The woman's lips trembled as she took a hesitant step forward, her hands shaking. "Ranger?" she whispered again, almost as if she couldn't believe her own eyes. Daniel expected the dog to run to her, jump into her arms, or bark in excitement. But he didn't. Ranger just stood there, unmoving, ears perked, but his expression unreadable. The old woman hesitated before kneeling down slightly, reaching out her hand. "It's me, sweetheart. It's okay." The moment stretched between them, heavy with something Daniel didn't quite understand. What was their connection? Ranger's body language wasn't that of a lost dog finding his owner. It was something deeper, something heavier. Daniel couldn't stay silent anymore. "Excuse me," he said, stepping forward carefully. "Do you know this dog?" The woman looked up, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. She swallowed hard, as if her throat had tightened. "I think I do." Her voice was barely above a whisper, filled with disbelief. Daniel glanced down at Ranger, who remained frozen in place, still staring at her. "I've been seeing him take the subway alone every morning," Daniel explained. "I don't think he's a stray, but I don't know where he comes from." The woman's breath shuddered as she slowly stood back up, pressing a trembling hand against her chest. "He's not a stray," she murmured. "Or at least, he wasn't." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" The woman took a deep breath, blinking quickly. "Would you come inside for a moment?" she asked, motioning toward the flower shop behind her. "There's something I need to tell you." Daniel hesitated, looking at Ranger. The dog still hadn't moved, still hadn't reacted, but something in his eyes told Daniel that this was exactly where he needed to be. "All right," Daniel said, nodding. The woman opened the shop's glass door, stepping inside. The faint scent of fresh flowers and warm earth filled the air, a comforting contrast to the tension that still hung between them. Daniel followed, glancing back once. Ranger was finally moving. The dog stepped forward slowly, tail low, and cautiously entered the shop. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. Whatever was happening here, it mattered. The woman walked behind the counter, placing a shaky hand on the surface for support. "My name is Helen," she said softly. "And if this dog is who I think he is, his name is Ranger." Daniel nodded, confirming. "That's the name you called out when you saw him." Helen exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of 1,000 emotions had just crashed down on her. "Ranger belonged to my son." Daniel's chest tightened. "Your son?" Helen nodded slowly, her eyes drifting toward the dog. "Matthew, he was a firefighter. Ranger was his canine partner." Daniel's breath caught. That explained why the dog was so well behaved, why he moved with such purpose, why he knew exactly where he was going. But something in Helen's voice told him there was more to the story. Daniel asked cautiously. Helen closed her eyes briefly, swallowing hard. "Matthew passed away 2 years ago." The words landed like a blow to Daniel's chest. He looked at Ranger, who had finally moved closer, sitting near Helen's feet. His ears were slightly drooped, his eyes soft, sad. Daniel's mind raced. "So, you think Ranger is coming here because of your son?" Helen nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Matthew used to bring Ranger here after work every day. They would stop by, he'd get coffee from the shop next door, and they'd sit outside for a little while before heading home." Daniel felt his throat tighten. The dog wasn't lost. He wasn't a stray, and he wasn't searching for an owner. He was coming home. Every single morning, Ranger took the train to the place where he last felt Matthew's presence. Daniel let out a breath, stunned by the weight of the realization. "He's still waiting for him," Daniel murmured. Helen let out a quiet sob, covering her mouth as she nodded. Ranger, as if sensing her pain, slowly lifted his head and nudged her hand with his nose. It was the first movement of affection he had shown since they arrived. Helen's body trembled as she dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around him. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. For the first time since Daniel had seen him, Ranger leaned into someone's touch. And Daniel? He stood frozen, watching as a broken dog and a grieving mother found a missing piece of their hearts. The air inside the flower shop felt heavy with emotion. Helen still knelt beside Ranger, her fingers tangled in his fur. As silent tears rolled down her cheeks, the German shepherd didn't move away. He just sat there, letting her hold him, his body no longer tense with hesitation. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to process everything. He had never expected to uncover a story of loss, love, and devotion when he first saw Ranger on the subway. He thought he was just a stray or maybe a lost pet, but now he understood. This dog wasn't lost. He was grieving. Helen finally pulled away slightly, her eyes red but filled with warmth as she looked at Ranger. "I don't understand how he survived," she whispered, stroking his head gently. "After Matthew passed, I thought Ranger was gone too." Daniel frowned, kneeling down to be at her level. "What do you mean? He disappeared?" Helen nodded slowly, taking a shaky breath. "After the funeral, I went to Matthew's apartment to take care of Ranger. But when I got there, the door was open, and he was gone. I searched everywhere. I put up flyers, called every shelter, every rescue organization, but no one ever found him." Her voice cracked, and she looked down at Ranger with a mixture of heartbreak and disbelief. "And now, 2 years later, he's here." Daniel glanced at Ranger, who sat patiently, his deep brown eyes flicking between them. "So you think he's been traveling here every day since then?" Helen exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "I don't know, but if he has—" She paused, looking at Ranger again. "It means he never stopped looking for Matthew." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. The thought of this dog spending the past 2 years wandering the city, riding the subway alone, returning to this spot in hopes of finding his best friend again. It was almost too much to bear. He reached out cautiously, his fingers brushing Ranger's fur. "Where has he been staying all this time?" Helen wiped her tears, shaking her head. "That's what I don't know. But he looks tired." Now that she mentioned it, Daniel could see it too. Ranger was strong, but his body carried the weight of his journey. His fur was dirty but not filthy, meaning he must have been finding shelter somewhere. But his ribs, though not fully exposed, hinted at days without consistent meals. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He's been surviving. But for how long?" Helen placed a gentle hand on Ranger's back, her expression shifting from sadness to determination. "I can't let him go again." Daniel looked at her, sensing the weight of her words. "Then let's find out where he's been living." Helen blinked. "How?" Daniel pulled out his phone, opening an app. "I put a GPS tracker on his collar this morning. I wanted to see where he was going." Helen's eyes widened. "You did what?" "I was curious," Daniel admitted, showing her the screen. "I've been watching his route, but now that we know why he comes here, we need to figure out where he's been spending the rest of his time." Helen leaned in, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the phone screen. The map showed a pattern of movement, station to station, street to street, but always looping back to one specific area. Helen narrowed her eyes. "That's near the old firehouse." Daniel looked at her. "Firehouse?" She nodded. "Matthew's old station. It was shut down a few years ago, but he used to take Ranger there all the time." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "You think he's been living there?" Helen swallowed hard, looking at Ranger. "Only one way to find out." Daniel stood up, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Let's go." Helen hesitated. "What if he doesn't want to leave?" Daniel looked down at the dog, whose eyes remained locked on Helen, as if he was still processing that she was real. "Then we show him that he doesn't have to be alone anymore." Ranger didn't flinch when Daniel clipped a leash onto his collar. For the first time, he allowed himself to be led. As they stepped outside, the crisp air filled Daniel's lungs. The city buzzed around them. People walking by, unaware that they were witnessing a story of unbreakable loyalty. Ranger, who had spent 2 years looking for someone who was no longer here, was about to realize he had never truly been alone. The walk toward the abandoned firehouse was quiet, filled with the weight of the discovery they had just made. Helen walked beside Ranger, still unable to take her eyes off him. Daniel led the way, checking his phone's GPS as they followed the route Ranger had taken dozens, maybe even hundreds of times before. The streets grew quieter as they moved away from the busy commercial district. The neighborhood was older, lined with brick buildings, faded storefronts, and cracked sidewalks. The firehouse stood at the corner of an empty street, its once bright red doors now rusted and worn by time. A for sale sign was stuck to one of the garage doors, the letters faded from years of neglect. Helen slowed down, gripping Daniel's arm. "This is it." Daniel glanced down at Ranger. The German Shepherd had stopped walking. His body was tense, his ears flicked forward, and his tail hung still behind him. For a long moment, he just stared at the firehouse. Then, without hesitation, he pulled forward. Helen gasped softly as Ranger led them to the side of the building, walking with familiarity, as if this wasn't just a place he visited. It was home. Daniel's chest tightened as he watched Ranger nose at a gap in the side fence, squeezing through with ease. "He knows his way in," Daniel murmured. Helen hesitated before pushing the gate open wider, slipping inside after him. The yard behind the firehouse was small, filled with overgrown weeds and debris from years of abandonment. A pile of discarded wooden pallets leaned against the wall, creating a makeshift shelter. Nearby, a plastic bowl sat on the ground, empty, but still there. Helen let out a shaky breath. "He's been living here." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "For 2 years. This has been his home." Ranger walked toward the wooden pallets and lay down, his body pressing against the cold, hard ground. His movements were familiar, like this was just another evening settling in for the night. Helen dropped to her knees. "Oh, sweetheart, you've been out here all this time." Her voice cracked, and Ranger lifted his head slightly, watching her. Daniel's throat tightened. Everything made sense now. Ranger had lost everything when Matthew died. He had run away from the apartment, not because he didn't want to be with Helen, but because he was looking for the only place that still felt like home. The firehouse had been his and Matthew's sanctuary, and when it closed down, it became a tomb filled with memories. Daniel crouched beside Helen, his voice gentle. He was waiting. Helen wiped at her eyes. "For Matthew?" Daniel nodded. "Or for someone to take him home." Ranger let out a deep sigh, resting his head on his paws. He looked exhausted. Like for the first time, he wasn't fighting to survive. He was just existing. Helen reached out hesitantly, brushing her fingers against his fur. "Come home with me, sweet boy." Ranger's body tensed slightly, but this time he didn't move away. He let her hand rest there, his breathing slow and steady. Daniel's heart pounded. This was the moment. Ranger had spent 2 years alone, believing he had no one left. But now, here she was, his family, waiting for him to come back. Helen took a slow, shaky breath. "Matthew would want you safe, Ranger." Ranger's ears twitched at the name. His tail gave the slightest flick. Helen gently ran her fingers down his back, her touch filled with warmth. "You don't have to wait anymore." The German Shepherd lifted his head, staring into her eyes. For a long, silent moment, they just looked at each other. And then, for the first time since they found him, Ranger moved. He crawled forward, pressing his head into Helen's lap. Helen let out a choked sob, wrapping her arms around him. "That's it, sweet boy. You're safe now." Daniel exhaled, feeling the weight in his chest finally lift. Ranger wasn't just surviving anymore. He had found his way home. Helen held Ranger in her arms, feeling the weight of his body finally relax against her. For 2 long years, he had been alone, surviving on instinct, carrying the unbearable grief of losing Matthew. But now, here he was, leaning into her touch, letting himself be comforted. Daniel sat beside them, his heart still racing. He had spent the past few days following this dog out of curiosity, trying to solve a mystery. But now he realized, Ranger wasn't a mystery. He was a survivor, a soul that had been desperately holding on to the last piece of his past. Helen wiped her tears, running her hands through Ranger's fur. "You don't have to do this anymore, sweetheart." The German Shepherd let out a long, deep sigh, the kind that came from exhaustion, relief, and acceptance. Daniel exhaled, his voice gentle. "Helen, we can't leave him here." Helen looked up, her eyes still wet, but filled with determination. "I know. I won't." She ran her hand along Ranger's back, feeling the slight ridges of his ribs beneath his thick fur. He had survived, but he wasn't thriving. He needed food, warmth, care. He needed a home. Helen shifted slightly, speaking softly. "Come on, sweet boy. Let's go home." For a moment, Ranger didn't move. He had spent so long here that leaving, even if it meant safety, felt foreign. Daniel leaned forward, watching carefully. "I think he's afraid to let go." Helen nodded. "He spent so much time waiting. He doesn't know what else to do." Ranger looked up at her, ears twitching. There was still hesitation in his eyes. He had never left this place willingly before. Helen didn't force him. Instead, she simply stood up and took a step back, holding out her hand. "It's okay, baby. You can trust me. Ranger's ears flicked, his nose twitching as he took in the moment. For
Years he had been alone. For years this was the only life he knew. And yet, here she was. His family, waiting for him to follow. Helen didn't move. Daniel didn't speak. Then, Ranger took a step forward. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The German Shepherd moved slowly, cautiously. His muscles were stiff, as if his body wasn't used to walking alongside another person anymore. But he didn't stop. He kept going. Helen smiled through her tears. "That's my good boy." Ranger reached her side and, without hesitation, pressed his head against her leg. Helen let out a sob, running her fingers through his fur. "You're coming home, sweetheart." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. Ranger had made his choice. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was ready to go home. Daniel drove while Helen sat in the back seat with Ranger, her hands never leaving his fur. She whispered to him softly, reassuring him with every mile they passed. Ranger rested his head on her lap, his body still tense, but no longer filled with fear. Daniel glanced at them through the rearview mirror. "I can't believe he was doing this for 2 years." Helen exhaled. "I should have known he was out there." Daniel shook his head. "You had no way of knowing, but now you found each other." Helen's fingers brushed over Ranger's ears. "Matthew loved him so much. He would want him safe." Daniel nodded. "And now he is." Ranger's tail flicked slightly. Daniel's lips curved into a small smile. "That's the first time I've seen him do that." Helen blinked, looking down. "What?" He wagged his tail. Helen's breath hitched as she looked down at the German Shepherd resting on her lap. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady, and, for the first time in years, his tail wagged again. Helen let out a quiet sob. "Oh, sweetheart, you're really coming home." The drive to Helen's house was quiet except for the soft hum of the engine. Ranger lay curled up in the back seat, his head resting on Helen's lap. His breathing was steady, his eyes half closed, but there was no more tension in his body. Daniel kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror, making sure Ranger was okay. Helen's fingers moved gently through his fur, offering him silent reassurance. For 2 years, this dog had been lost, not physically, but emotionally. Now, he had finally found his way home. Helen sighed, still stroking Ranger's back. "I wonder if he remembers the house." Daniel glanced at her. "Did he live with you before?" Helen nodded slowly. "Before Matthew moved into his own place, yes. Ranger was just a puppy back then, but he was always so attached to him." Daniel exhaled, tightening his grip on the wheel. That explained everything. The firehouse, the flower shop, the subway rides. Ranger had spent 2 years searching for the life he lost. Now, it was time for him to start a new one. They finally pulled into Helen's driveway, a small but cozy house with a white picket fence. The moment the car stopped, Ranger lifted his head, sniffing the air. His ears perked slightly, and his tail twitched once, as if something felt familiar. Helen smiled softly. "Come on, baby, let's go inside." Daniel opened the back door, stepping aside as Helen carefully got out. Ranger hesitated, staring at the house. His paws shifted slightly, his body language unsure. Helen knelt in front of him, reaching out her hand. "It's okay, sweetheart. This is your home now." Ranger's eyes flickered with something deep. Recognition, maybe? Or just the first hint of trust. And then, he stepped forward. One step, then another. Helen inhaled sharply, her eyes misty. Daniel felt his chest tighten. They walked toward the front door together. Ranger's tail remained low, but not tucked. His ears flicked as he sniffed the door, the porch, the air. Something inside him recognized this place. Helen pushed the door open, stepping inside. The house smelled like fresh coffee, old books, and warmth. Ranger stood in the doorway, his paws resting on the threshold. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, he stepped inside. Helen let out a quiet sob, covering her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. "You're home." Ranger turned, looking up at her. His deep brown eyes held something different now. Not just sadness, not just loss, but acceptance. He took another step forward and gently nudged her leg with his nose. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. Helen knelt, wrapping her arms around him. "You don't have to wait anymore." Ranger leaned into her touch. Daniel exhaled, stepping back slightly, giving them a moment. Ranger had been waiting for 2 years for someone to come back for him. Now, he didn't have to wait anymore. He was finally home. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the quiet neighborhood. Helen sat on the living room floor, her back resting against the couch. Ranger lay beside her, his head on her lap, his body finally at ease. For the first time in 2 years, he was not alone. Daniel sat across from them, watching in silence. He had followed this dog out of curiosity, trying to solve a mystery. But this wasn't a mystery. It was a story of love, loss, and unwavering loyalty. Helen's fingers gently ran through Ranger's fur. "You were waiting all this time, weren't you?" Ranger let out a deep, content sigh. His tail flicked once against the wooden floor. Helen smiled through her tears. "Matthew would be so happy to see you here." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. Helen's gaze softened. "Thank you, Daniel." Daniel shook his head. "I didn't do anything. He found his way back to you on his own." Helen wiped at her eyes, looking down at Ranger. "I should have known he never gave up. He was always so loyal. Matthew always said that if anything ever happened to him, Ranger wouldn't stop looking for him." Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "It's incredible. He didn't just survive, he held on to the memory of your son. That's why he kept coming back to the flower shop, to the firehouse. He was searching for pieces of Matthew." Helen nodded, her fingers brushing over Ranger's ear. "And now he has one last piece of him. His home." Ranger's ears flicked, as if he understood. Then, he did something that made Helen's breath hitch. Slowly, carefully, Ranger lifted his head and licked her cheek. Helen let out a soft, choked laugh. "Oh, sweetheart, you finally trust me again." Daniel smiled. "That's the happiest I've seen him." Helen chuckled, wiping away the last of her tears. "I think he finally knows he's safe." Ranger curled up a little closer to her, his breathing steady, his body relaxed. For 2 years, he had wandered, waiting for someone who would never return. Now, he didn't have to wait anymore, because he was finally, truly, home. Ranger's story is a powerful reminder of loyalty, love, and second chances. For 2 years, he never gave up, holding on to the last pieces of a life he lost, hoping to find his way back home. And in the end, he did, but not in the way he expected. Ranger thought he was searching for someone who was gone, but instead he found someone who would love him just as deeply. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in the power of second chances. Because sometimes, even when all hope seems lost, love finds a way.